Off. I met with the credit union. I have a path. Saying it aloud made my throat go tight again, pride braided with terror. It felt strange to speak like someone with a plan in front of a man who had only ever told me my plans were daydreams in better shoes. My mother blinked. She did what? Mr. Hayes nodded. A dedicated account for repairs and capital expenses, funded from rental income, and a small annuity she purchased when she sold a parcel 20 years ago. Noah has signatory authority. Again, she prepared. The line between my father's brows deepened. He pivoted. He always did. Elena, he said without looking at her, the way a foreman talks to the crew. Call Holden Realty. Tell them to send over the management contract template. We'll draft something advisory. If the boy refuses, we file an injunction to prevent waste. We claim he's jeopardizing a multi-million-dollar asset. We can get a temporary order in 48 hours. Martin, Mr. Hayes said, finally letting the weariness show. If you file anything, attachment C triggers. The cabins move to the trust the moment your action hits the clerk's desk. You will be suing to shrink the estate you claim to protect. My father looked at him the way a frustrated chess player looks at a board that refuses to produce a weak square. Then we'll negotiate. We'll present terms he cannot refuse. I watched the window. A pair of J's bounced between the fir branches like two notes on opposite ends of a piano. For a second, the ordinary world pierced the room with the simple fact of itself. I thought of guests who would check in next month with backpacks and warm socks. The couple who returned every anniversary and took the same photo in front of the carved bear by the front steps. The school group that came once a year to learn to snowshoe and left us a card with clumsy signatures shaped like little mountains. The lodge was not a spreadsheet. It was a place where lives brushed against each other and picked up a little of the other's snow. The door clicked. We all turned. In the hallway, two soft voices exchanged a few rapid words, and then Mr. Hayes' secretary stepped in with an apologetic tilt of her head. "I'm so sorry to interrupt," she said, eyes scanning the tension like a weather report. "But there's a gentleman here insisting he needs to speak to whoever is responsible for the lodge. He says it cannot wait." My father stood, seeing an opening. "Send him in," he said before Mr. Hayes could answer. "We represent the family." The secretary hesitated and then looked at me. Her eyes asked questions. I nodded once. "It's fine," I said. "If it's about the lodge, I should hear it." A man stepped in who didn't look like a developer or a banker. He looked like a local who knows the mountain's moods. Windburned cheeks, clean jacket with a park emblem stitched at the chest, an envelope tucked under his arm. He took in the conference room, my parents' posture, Mr. Hayes' neat stack of papers, my hands flat on the table, then rested his gaze on me as if testing a door he hoped would open. "You Noah?" he said. "Yes. I'm Dan from Forest Service," he said. "We've been in touch with Mrs. Novak in the past. I tried to call yesterday, but..." He stopped, glanced toward the folder with my grandmother's name, and recalibrated. "We flagged something on last week's trail inspection down by the south parcel. You got a moment?" He lifted the envelope. On the corner was a map. My father exhaled in irritation. "We're in the middle of legal proceedings," he said. "Whatever it is, it can wait." Dan shook his head. "It can't," he said simply. "There's a survey marker that moved, and a path cut that shouldn't be. It looks like someone started putting stakes in along the creek. Private stakes. Not ours." He slid a photo from the envelope, bright orange flags fluttering in front of a line of alders. "If those are where I think they are, someone's planning to run a road. Right through the lower meadow." Elena leaned forward despite herself. "A road? Who?" "Not sure yet," Dan said. "We found tire tracks that don't match usual maintenance. And this." He placed another item on the table, a laminated badge half hidden in dirt. The logo on it made my father's face go still. Holden Development. I didn't know the name, but my father did. I could read it in the way his jaw worked once, twice, as if chewing a thought he didn't want to swallow. The badge had a first name and an initial. The same developer my grandmother had named on the video. The same one whose letter she had refused. Mr. Hayes swore under his breath in a very careful way that added no heat to the room. "If they've started encroaching," he said, "we can get an emergency order. But we need proof. Photos, GPS witnesses." Dan nodded. "I've got some. Not enough for a judge who likes everything in triplicate." He tipped the envelope toward me. "But I figured the owner should know. Before the stakes become gravel." My mother spoke up for the first time in minutes, voice tight. "We had nothing to do with that." It came out fast, unasked, a defense against a charge no one had made explicitly yet. It hung in the air like a foghorn in clear weather. Elena found her footing again. "Dan, you said you worked with our grandmother in the past," she said, switching to friendly neighbor mode. "You know we all want what's best." Dan's eyes slid past her to me. "What I know," he said evenly, "is that Mrs. Novak called twice last year about a different neighbor who tried to cut a new path. She was clear about boundaries. She walked them herself. He nodded at me. You want to walk them now? My father laughed once, a small dry sound. Now, he said. In the middle of this? Dan didn't look at him. The flags will be gone by tomorrow if the person who set them knows they've been seen. I felt a current move under my ribs, the kind of hard clarity that arrives not with triumph, but with the sense that you are standing exactly where your next step must be. This was not about a contract I could negotiate around a table. This was about the land itself. The creek that threaded the meadow. The little footbridge I'd mended with my grandmother in spring. I stood without realizing I had. We'll go, I said. We, my mother echoed, as if the word were a challenge. I looked at Dan. I'll go, I corrected. Mr. Hayes, if there's a way to file something today, file it. If there's a form, hand it to me when I get back. Elena. I hesitated. I won't stop you from hiring a lawyer. But the first thing I'm doing as the person who now holds the keys is walking those boundary lines. Elena opened her mouth to argue. My father beat her to it. You're not leaving this room with this unsettled, he said, hand flat on the table as if he could pin the moment like a paper. You think you can run out to the woods and play surveyor, and that makes you an owner? Sit down. Something in his voice, the old leash hidden in it, tugged out a version of me that always sat. But then I saw my grandmother on the screen again, bones thinner but eyes steady, telling me that some decisions must be made with your feet, not just your head. I reached for the envelope. Dan slid it toward me. The paper rasped on the wood like a quiet yes. Mr. Hayes cleared his throat. Before you go, he said, one more thing. He pulled a small, heavy object from a drawer and set it down in front of me. It was a brass key on a fob with an etched number I knew by heart. 3. The safe deposit box at Maple Street Credit Union. My grandmother and I had visited that vault once, years ago, when she wanted to show me where old letters slept. She asked me to give you this at the reading, he said. I was going to hand it over after, but given the developments, I think now is wiser. He hesitated. She said there are documents in there you would know what to do with if anyone tried to bend the mountain into a straight line. The room seemed to tilt a degree, like a ship turning. My father stared at the key as if it were a piece of metal that could ruin a generation. My mother looked trapped between two versions of herself. One who wanted to stop this, and one who wanted to go home and sit in the quiet for the first time in years. Elena's eyes flickered. Not greed, exactly, but calculation, trying to compute what new information might do to the game board. I slipped the key into my pocket. It had a reassuring weight, not heavy like a chain, but heavy like a tool. I looked at my parents one by one. I'm walking the boundary, I said again, quieter. You can come if you want, but I'm not asking permission. Dan nodded toward the door with a half grin that wasn't unkind. Bring boots, he said. It's muddy down by the creek. My father pushed his chair back, so suddenly it scraped the floor. Elena, he said, voice clipped, call Holden. Tell them to stand by. Then ring Patterson at the firm. If he's in court, have him pulled out. We're moving. He turned to Mr. Hayes with a look that was almost pity, almost fury. You may think you've locked this up with clauses and videos, but you underestimate how much muscle the world gives people who refuse to be sidelined. Mr. Hayes didn't flinch. I don't underestimate anything, he said. I only read what is. I took a breath that tasted like bark and paper and the metal of the key. Dan held the door. The hallway smelled faintly of toner and rain. Behind me, I heard my mother stand as if a string had pulled her up. Noah, she said, and the way she said my name made me stop with one hand on the doorframe. You're making a mistake. I turned enough to meet her eyes. For a heartbeat, we were two people in a story neither of us had written, only inherited. Maybe, I said, but it will be mine. We stepped into the hall, and the closing door cut the conference room in half, like a photograph shuttering. Dan moved fast, purposeful, the kind of fast that comes from knowing the difference between urgent and loud. Outside, the mountain air shook the tightness out of my lungs. We headed for his truck. He handed me the envelope, and I tucked it under my arm, the corner of the map poking my skin through the jacket as if insisting on being felt. Halfway down the steps, my phone buzzed. A number I didn't recognize. I almost ignored it. Dan paused, reading my hesitation like trail sign. Could be important, he said. I answered. Hello. A calm, unfamiliar voice. Is this Noah Novak? Yes. This is Holden Development, the voice said, polite in that way that filed off fingerprints. We understand there's been a change in circumstances. We'd like to make you an offer directly for the meadow and creek rights. Expedited, generous, and confidential. If you accept within 24 hours, we can wire a substantial deposit today. I stopped on the second to last step. Wind moved through the firs with a sound like a match being struck. I don't sell what isn't for sale, I said. The voice smiled without moving a face. Everything has a price, Noah. Even principles. Even nostalgia. especially when those around you are persuasive. My father's voice in the conference room. Elena's pen poised to turn air into contracts. The brass key warm in my pocket. Dan watching my face with patient attention. My grandmother's recording, steady and unashamed, naming what people had tried to do in the kind of daylight that makes shadows honest. What exactly? I asked, and my voice surprised me by how steady it was. Do you think you're buying? There was a soft chuckle. Time. Silence. Easement. You can keep your little lodge cosplay. We just need a road. A road. Through the meadow. Past the bridge I'd patched with my grandmother while she told me that snowmelt sings a different note every year. I stared at the valley where the creek ran like a thread of glass no one had the right to smudge. Dan touched the envelope. We should go, he said. I lifted the phone again. I'll give you my answer, I said. But not on a call. 24 hours, the voice repeated. After that, we take a different route. The line went dead. I slid the phone into my pocket. We climbed into the truck. The door thunk, a kind of answer to the world's suggestion that everything bends with enough pressure. Dan started the engine. The wipers began a slow rhythm across the windshield as a light rain started to patter, each drop a small percussion on the hood. We turned down the drive toward the south parcel, the trees closing in like an audience leaning forward, the map between us on the bench seat, that brass key heavy against my thigh, and somewhere behind us a conference room where my family was deciding whether to become my opponents or my witnesses. As the truck's tires found the gravel, Dan glanced over. You know, he said, tone conversational like he was asking about weather. If those stakes are where I think they are, they'd have to have permission from the adjacent owner too. The old Hanson parcel. But Hanson sold last year to a shell company out of state. No listed address. I gripped the envelope a little tighter. Do you know the company name? He nodded. Ridgepoint Acquisitions. I didn't recognize it. But the way Dan added, almost as an afterthought, we traced a contact number for Ridgepoint once. It forwarded to a landline in town, made my chest fold inward. Whose? I asked. Dan shot me a brief, apologetic look. The caller ID pinged something like Patterson and Lowe. Your father mentioned a Patterson, didn't he? The truck rolled on. The rain sharpened, thin as needles, startling in its suddenness. We took the turn where the gravel gives up and becomes dirt, the meadow opening to our right like a held breath. In the distance, bright as a wrong note in a familiar song, a line of orange flags fluttered in a wind that had started to rise. And just as I slid my hand into my pocket to feel the key again, a second phone began to buzz, not mine this time, but Dan's, lighting up his dash with a caller ID I couldn't see. He frowned, glanced at it, and then handed me the device without taking his eyes off the rutted road. You should answer, he said. It's Mr. Hayes. I brought the phone to my ear, the meadow opening, the flag snapping, the creek glinting like a thin blade, and Mr. Hayes' voice came through over a hiss of office air. Noah, he said, I just opened the sealed letter that came with your grandmother's video. There's something you need to know before you set foot on that meadow. It changes everything about who can and can't put a road there. He paused, the kind of pause that rearranges furniture inside a life. Your grandmother recorded a deed transfer to you and to someone else. Co-ownership of the south parcel, named by first and middle only, to avoid attention. She wrote that the second owner would know when the time came. Mr. Hayes' voice in Dan's truck sounded like the mountain itself was holding its breath. Noah, he said, your grandmother transferred the south parcel to you and one other person. She didn't want the name read unless it was necessary, but with those flags out there, it's necessary. The co-owner is Daniel Hayes. Me. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard. My grandmother had made her lawyer a co-owner of part of the land, but then the pieces began to fall together like stones finally finding their places in a wall. He'd been more than her lawyer. He'd been her friend for 40 years. He and his wife had shared dinners at the lodge, helped her through winters, and, as I now realized, promised her one thing my family never could, protection. By tying him to the land legally, she had ensured someone with both power and loyalty would stand guard if anyone tried to chip away at her wishes. Dan turned the wheel, guiding the truck closer to the meadow where the orange flags fluttered. That, he said slowly, changes the game. It did. Because now it wasn't just me, the estranged grandson with limited experience, holding the line against developers and my parents' schemes. It was me and a seasoned lawyer who had spent decades navigating contracts and courts, who had his own skin in the fight. The lodge wasn't standing alone anymore. When we reached the meadow, the rain had stopped, leaving the air sharp with wet grass and pine. The flags cut across the earth like wounds. Dan took photos while I crouched near the creek, running my hand across the damp soil, where tire tracks curved too close to the water. The creek whispered as it always had, unbothered but watchful. I thought of my grandmother's words, Sometimes love is proven by who shows up with firewood when the stove goes out. I had shown up. She had made sure I wasn't the only one. That evening, back in town, we met at Mr. Hayes' office. He laid out the co-ownership deed, stamped and sealed. "This is airtight," he told me. "With me named, Holden can't bully you with threats of inexperience. And if your parents want to file something, they'll have to do it against me too. I've spent my career preparing for people who think pressure is a substitute for principle." It was the first time in my life an adult had looked at me not as someone to scold or rescue, but as a partner. The next morning, we filed an emergency injunction against Holden's encroachment, attaching the photos and Dan's sworn statement. Word spread quickly. By the end of the week, a judge had ordered Holden to cease all activity near the creek until further notice. The orange flags were pulled out, their absence as loud as their presence had been. My parents, furious, tried to push through back channels. Elena drafted proposals for advisory committees, waving them in front of me with that same polished smile. My father hinted at loans, just until you find your footing. My mother tried guilt, sitting across from me at the lodge's kitchen table saying, "Your grandmother would hate seeing us like this." But here's what she didn't understand. My grandmother had already seen us like this. That's why she had written those clauses. That's why she'd given me the key and given Hayes the deed. Love wasn't blind, it was watchful. The months that followed weren't easy. Running the lodge meant dawns spent fixing heaters, afternoons answering booking emails, nights making sure guests had firewood stacked high enough. But it also meant laughter in the dining hall, the smell of pancakes on winter mornings, hikers returning with stories of trails that left them breathless. Every time I felt doubt creep in, I'd walk the creek line, where the flags had once stood, and remind myself, this place is still whole. Holden eventually pulled out. They couldn't fight the injunction, not with Hayes holding co-ownership and my grandmother's affidavit making their prior dealings look like vultures circling too soon. The shell company that bought the Hanson parcel dissolved within 6 months. The road project vanished like smoke in the wind. As for my parents, they stopped calling after a while. At first, I thought the silence would ache. But instead, it made room for new sounds, the laughter of guests, the crunch of snow under boots, the steady hum of a place alive and unbroken. Elena sent one last email, terse and professional, saying she wished me the best, but hoped I'd reconsider partnership in the future. I didn't reply. Some messages deserve to sit unread. One spring morning, as the meadow bloomed with wildflowers, I found myself sitting on the porch steps where my grandmother and I used to rest after chores. I pulled the brass key from my pocket. Inside the safe deposit box, I had found letters she'd written just for me. Advice, encouragement, and one final reminder. Noah, mountains outlast those who only see them as stone, but they remember those who walk their paths with care. I smiled then, a real one, not forced or defensive, because she was right. The lodge wasn't just worth $1.9 million. It was worth every moment of struggle it had taken to protect it. It was worth my name, my effort, my future. And it was worth hers. That's how it ended. Not with a sale, not with a fight lost, but with a family's greed turned back by foresight and trust. My parents had walked into that while reading thinking they'd already won. But my grandmother had seen the truth long before they arrived. She had chosen love over image, legacy over greed. And now, every time guests check in, every time I hear boots on the porch at night or laughter echoing through the halls, I know exactly what she meant when she asked if I knew my worth. I know now, and it's measured not in their approval, not in dollar signs, but in every heartbeat this lodge still holds, untouched, unbroken, and finally, truly mine.